The first alarm hit me like a fist. Red light flooded the cockpit before I even understood what had broken. My ship, the Solace, shuddered so hard that my restraints cut into my shoulders, and the console in front of me exploded into a wall of warnings. Hull breach, reactor core unstable, life support failing in Section 2. I did not have time to think. My hands moved on their own, slamming switches, sealing bulkheads, trying to save what could still be saved. Somewhere behind me, in the cargo hold, something tore loose and slammed into the wall with a sound like a dying animal. The ship rolled, and for a moment I saw nothing but stars spinning past the viewport, endless and uncaring. My name is Vess. I am a pilot of the Kelvari, a species that has crossed the void for longer than most young civilizations have existed. We are careful. We are calm. We do not panic, because panic wastes air, wastes time, wastes the last precious seconds a person might have. That is what I told myself as my ship died around me. I would not panic. I would think. I had been on a routine survey mission, mapping a quiet stretch of space near a dead star, when the anomaly hit. It came without warning, a wave of gravitational distortion that should not have existed according to every model my people had built over centuries. It struck the Solace broadside and tore through my shielding like it was nothing. My reactor took the worst of it. I remember the sound most of all, a groan of metal that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the ship itself was crying out. By the time the shaking stopped, I already knew the truth. I was not going to fly out of this. The Solace was a small survey craft, built for speed and precision, not for surviving disasters. My navigation system was gone. My long-range communicator was gone. My reactor was venting radiation in slow, dangerous pulses, and I had sealed myself into the only compartment still holding air. I sat very still for a long moment, listening to my own breathing, letting the silence settle over me. This was the moment my training had prepared me for. Assess the situation. Do not waste energy on fear. I ran the numbers in my head, the way every Kelvari pilot is taught from childhood. Life support reserves, power reserves, distance from any known trade route, distance from any Kelvari outpost. The numbers were not good. I was drifting in a region my people called the Long Quiet, a stretch of space so far from any settled system that even our fastest ships would need weeks to reach it. My emergency beacon had a range far shorter than that distance. Even if I sent it, even if by some miracle another Kelvari vessel picked it up, help would arrive long after my air ran out. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because honesty matters more to me now than it ever did before. I felt afraid, not the sharp fear of the impact itself, but a slow, creeping fear that settles into your chest and stays there. It is the fear of knowing exactly how much time you have left, and knowing it is not enough. Our culture does not talk about death easily. We are taught that resources are finite, that a life lost in the void is simply a loss, one to be recorded and mourned quietly, not one to be fought against with everything a fleet might have. I had grown up believing this was simply how the universe worked. You went out, you did your duty, and if something happened far from help, you accepted it with dignity. No one came for you. No one could afford to. I checked my life support readout again. 12 days of breathable air if I shut down every non-essential system. Maybe 14 if I was careful about how much I moved, how much oxygen my body burned with each breath. 12 days, alone, in a dead patch of space that no one traveled through. I thought about sending the beacon anyway. It felt almost foolish, a habit more than a hope, like leaving a light on in a house you know is empty. But something in me refused to simply wait without trying. I moved through the ship, checking every system by hand since most of the automated diagnostics had failed. The cargo hold was a ruin, equipment scattered and broken, but I found what I needed in a storage locker that had somehow survived intact. An old backup transmitter, low-powered, barely more than a toy compared to my main communicator, but it still had a spark of life in it. I carried it back to the cockpit and began wiring it into what remained of my power grid. My hands were steadier than I expected. Maybe it was the training. Maybe it was simply that having something to do was better than sitting with my thoughts. It took me nearly 6 hours to get the backup transmitter working, patching cables that had melted, rerouting power from a secondary battery that had barely survived the impact. By the time I finished, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. I sat back in my chair and looked at the small blinking light that told me the signal was ready to send. I remember hesitating before I pressed the switch. There is a strange kind of vulnerability in admitting you need help, in sending a call out into the dark and knowing that most likely no one will ever hear it. But I pressed it anyway. The signal went out in a wide, weak burst, repeating every few minutes, carrying my ship's identification, my last known coordinates, and a simple request: assistance needed, life support failing. Any vessel receiving this signal, please respond. Then I waited. The first hour passed in silence. The second hour passed the same way. I busied myself with small tasks, patching minor leaks, rationing my remaining food supplies, checking the reactor readings every so often to make sure the radiation levels were not climbing faster than expected. Each task was small, almost meaningless against the scale of what was happening, but it kept my mind from spiraling into the kind of fear that makes people stop functioning altogether. As the ship settled into its long, silent drift, I found myself looking out at the stars. From where I sat, the view was strangely beautiful, considering how much danger surrounded me. Distant suns burned quietly, indifferent to the small crisis unfolding in front of them. I thought about my family, back on my home world, and wondered if they would ever learn what happened to me, or if I would simply become another name added to a list of the lost, filed away and remembered only in passing. I thought, too, about the stories I had heard of other species, the ones who traveled the void alongside us, and the strange rumors that had begun spreading in recent years about a new species called humans. My people spoke of them the way you might speak of a storm, something powerful and unpredictable, admired from a distance but never fully trusted. They were said to be reckless, driven by emotion rather than logic, prone to taking risks that no sensible species would ever consider. Some elders spoke of them with quiet respect. Others spoke of them with open suspicion, warning that a species so willing to throw away resources for uncertain gains could never truly understand the discipline needed to survive in space. I did not think much about humans as I sat there, waiting for a response that I did not expect to come. They were a distant curiosity, a rumor from another part of the galaxy, not something relevant to my situation. My focus was on survival, on stretching every resource as far as it could go, on accepting the quiet reality that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. The reactor gave another small shudder, and a fresh warning light blinked on my console. I reached over and adjusted the containment field, buying myself perhaps another hour before I would need to make a harder decision about power distribution. My hands moved with practiced calm, even as something inside me tightened with every passing minute. I sent the signal again, watching the small light blink steadily into the dark. Then I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes for just a moment, and allowed myself to feel the full weight of my situation. I was alone, drifting through the long quiet, with 12 days of air and no real reason to believe anyone would come. But I had sent the signal anyway, and somewhere deep inside me, beneath all the training and all the careful acceptance of Kelvari philosophy, a small and stubborn part of me still hoped. The first day passed slowly, marked only by the soft hum of failing systems and the occasional groan of metal settling under stress. I forced myself into a routine, because routine was the only thing standing between me and despair. Wake, check the reactor, check the air, ration a small portion of food, rest, repeat. I told myself this was discipline. In truth, it was survival of the mind as much as the body. By the second day, the silence had become its own kind of pressure. I had grown used to the sound of a crew around me, the low chatter of other pilots on long missions, the comforting hum of a working ship. Now there was only my own breathing and the occasional creak of stressed metal. I began talking to myself, quietly at first, then more openly, just to fill the emptiness. I told myself stories from my childhood, recited old Kelvari sayings about patience and endurance, anything to keep my mind from drifting toward darker places. On the third day, I allowed myself to think about home. I pictured the long, pale towers of my home city, the quiet gardens where families gathered in the evenings, the sound of my mother's voice calling me in for meals when I was young. I wondered if she would ever learn what became of me, or if my ship would simply be marked as lost, a small notation in some official record, forgotten within a generation. My people do not fear death in the way some species do, but we do fear meaninglessness. To die quietly, unnoticed, far from anyone who might remember you, is considered one of the harder fates among my kind. I found myself hoping, selfishly perhaps, that even if no one came to rescue me, someone would eventually find the wreck of the Solace and know what had happened. The fourth day brought a new problem. The reactor containment field, which I had been nursing along with careful adjustments, began to fail more seriously. I spent nearly 10 hours awake, rerouting power, sealing off sections of the ship I no longer needed, trying to buy myself more time. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking from exhaustion, and I had used up nearly a full day's worth of my remaining energy reserves just to keep the radiation from reaching dangerous levels in the section where I slept. I remember lying in my narrow bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, doing the math over and over in my head. 12 days had become closer to 9, if I was being honest about how much power I had already burned through fixing the containment field. 9 days, alone, in the long quiet. On the 5th day, I began to notice something strange happening in my own mind. I would catch myself hearing voices that were not there, faint fragments of conversation drifting just at the edge of hearing, gone the moment I turned to listen. I recognized this for what it was, a symptom of isolation and stress that Calvari medical training warned about but rarely prepared you to actually experience. I forced myself to speak aloud more often after that, just to remind myself of what my own voice actually sounded like, to keep the line between reality and imagination clear. I thought often about the crew members I had trained alongside, wondering if any of them had ever faced something like this. Our training included survival scenarios, of course, simulations meant to prepare us for exactly this kind of situation, but no simulation ever truly captures the weight of real isolation, the way time stretches and compresses in strange ways when you are alone with nothing but your own thoughts and a slowly ticking clock. By the 6th day, I had settled into something like acceptance, not the calm, dignified acceptance my culture praised, but a quieter, sadder version of it. I stopped checking the beacon readout every hour and instead checked it only twice a day, once in the morning and once before I tried to sleep. Each time, the screen showed the same thing. No response received. I had expected this, and yet each time I saw those words, something in my chest tightened just a little more. On the 7th day, I allowed myself to write. I found an old data pad in a storage compartment, one used for cataloging survey samples, and I began recording my thoughts, partly as a way to pass the time, and partly because some part of me wanted there to be a record, however small, of who I had been and what had happened to me. I wrote about my family. I wrote about my training. I wrote about the strange beauty of the stars outside my viewport, indifferent and endless, watching my small crisis unfold without any concern at all. It was on the 8th day that everything changed. I was running a routine scan of the surrounding space, more out of habit than any real expectation of finding something, when a faint signal appeared on my sensors. My heart, if I can call it that in the way humans might understand the phrase, seemed to stop for a moment. I sat frozen, staring at the small blip on my screen, afraid to believe what I was seeing. A ship. Something was approaching. I ran every diagnostic I could to confirm the reading was real and not simply a malfunction in my damaged sensor array. The signal held steady, growing slightly stronger with each passing minute. Something was moving through the long quiet, and it was moving in my direction. My first reaction was not hope. It was fear. I want to explain this carefully, because I know it might seem strange to someone hearing this story for the first time. In the region of space where I had drifted, few ships traveled at all, and those that did were rarely Calvari vessels. The long quiet bordered territories, claimed by several species, some more trustworthy than others. There were stories, some exaggerated and some perhaps true, of ships that preyed on the stranded and the helpless, of crews who saw a disabled vessel not as someone in need of rescue, but as an opportunity. I began working quickly, trying to determine the identity of the approaching ship before it came close enough to matter. My damaged sensors struggled to pull a clear signature, but slowly, piece by piece, an image began to form. The ship's configuration did not match anything from my own people's registry. It did not match the known patterns of the species most commonly found in this region either. Then, finally, a partial identification code came through, garbled by distance and interference, but clear enough to read. The prefix matched something I had heard about only in passing conversations and cautious briefings back home. It was a human transponder code. I sat very still, staring at the screen, trying to decide what this meant for me. Everything I had ever heard about humans came rushing back at once. The stories of their recklessness, the warnings from Kelvari elders about a species that acted on impulse rather than careful calculation, the rumors that humans sometimes traveled into dangerous, unclaimed regions of space for reasons that made little sense to more cautious species, chasing risks that a rational mind would avoid. I did not know what to expect. Would they see my ship and simply pass by, unwilling to risk their own vessel for a stranger from another species entirely? Would they see an opportunity to take whatever remained of my cargo, leaving me to face my fate alone? Or was there some truth to the quieter rumors I had also heard, whispered less often but just as persistent, that humans had a strange habit of risking everything for people they had never even met? I checked the beacon signal one more time, making sure it was still transmitting clearly. My hands trembled slightly as I did, not from the cold of the ship's failing systems, but from the uncertainty of what was coming toward me through the dark. The ship continued to close the distance, moving with a speed that surprised me. Most vessels, upon detecting a distress signal in unclaimed space, would approach cautiously, scanning carefully before committing to any kind of rescue attempt. This ship moved differently. It came in fast, almost recklessly fast, cutting through the void as if time itself were the enemy, rather than the dangers that might be waiting. I watched the readout with a strange mixture of hope and dread, unsure which feeling would win out by the time the ship finally arrived. Whatever was coming, I would know soon enough. The distance between us continued to shrink, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting to see what kind of arrival this would truly be. Behind me, the reactor gave another warning pulse, a reminder that time was not on my side, no matter who was approaching. I forced myself to focus, running through every possible outcome in my mind, preparing myself as best I could for whatever was about to happen. Whether this ship brought rescue or something far worse, I would face it with whatever calm I had left. The signal grew stronger, the ship grew closer, and somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath all the fear and all the careful Kelvari training telling me to expect the worst, a small and stubborn spark of hope refused to go out completely. The ship dropped out of its approach speed sharply, close enough now that my sensors could finally paint a clear picture of it. It was larger than the Solace by a wide margin, built with a design that looked rougher than the elegant, efficient lines of Kelvari engineering. Where our ships were built for careful precision, this vessel looked like it was built for endurance, for taking damage and continuing forward regardless. A voice came through my communicator before I even had a chance to open a channel myself. It was rough with static, but the words were clear enough to understand once my translation systems caught up. This is the transport vessel Meridian, responding to your distress signal. Do you copy? I sat frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond. Every instinct told me to be cautious, to reveal as little as possible until I understood their intentions. But another part of me, the part that had spent 8 days alone in the dark, with nothing but my own fading hope, needed to answer. This is the Kelvari survey vessel Solus, I said, my voice sounding strange even to myself after so many days of silence. I am the sole occupant. My reactor is failing, and my life support has limited reserves remaining. There was a brief pause on the other end, filled only with static. Then the voice returned, sharper now, more urgent. Copy that, Solus. Hold tight. we are coming to you. I want to explain what happened next as clearly as I can, because it remains one of the strangest and most confusing experiences of my life. Based on everything I had heard about caution in unclaimed space, I expected the human ship to slow its approach, to scan my vessel carefully for threats, to communicate with some kind of command authority before committing to any action. Instead, the Meridian continued closing the distance at a speed that seemed almost reckless. Through my viewport, I watched the ship grow larger with each passing second, its hull marked with the scars of past journeys, patches of different colored metal where repairs had clearly been made in a hurry rather than with careful craftsmanship. It was not a beautiful ship in the way Kelvari vessels were beautiful, but there was something compelling about it, something that spoke of a crew who had faced difficulty before and had simply kept going. A second voice came through the channel, different from the first, quicker, and layered with what I would later learn was concern rather than simple procedure. Solace, this is Laura Bennett, ship's engineer. We are reading your reactor signature and it does not look good. How much time do you have? I gave her the numbers as calmly as I could manage, though my voice wavered slightly as I spoke. Perhaps 3 days remaining on life support, assuming no further failures. The containment field on my reactor is unstable and could fail sooner than that. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, followed by rapid conversation between several voices that I could only partially hear, overlapping and urgent. I caught fragments. Someone arguing about docking procedures. Someone else insisting there was no time for standard protocol. A third voice, calmer than the others, cutting through with quiet authority. Then the first voice returned, the one who had first answered my distress call. Solace, this is Ryan Coleman, captain of the Meridian. We are going to dock directly with your vessel, rather than using a shuttle. It will be faster. I need you to move to your airlock and stand by. Can you do that? I confirmed that I could, though something in his plan concerned me deeply. Direct docking with a damaged vessel was risky, especially one with an unstable reactor. If something went wrong during the connection, both ships could be damaged, possibly fatally for everyone involved. I said as much, trying to warn them of the danger they seemed willing to accept without hesitation. Ryan's response came quickly, and there was no trace of doubt in his voice at all. We know the risk. We are still coming. I did not understand this response. Everything in my training told me that no rational crew would risk their own vessel and their own lives for a stranger from another species, especially not when standard, safer options were available. A shuttle crossing would have taken longer, but it would have kept the Meridian itself out of danger. Yet here they were, choosing the faster, riskier option without any apparent hesitation. I made my way through the ship toward the airlock, moving carefully through sections where the artificial gravity had begun to fail unevenly, some areas heavier than others due to the damaged systems. The walk that would normally have taken me only a minute or two stretched out much longer, my body weakened by days of rationed food and constant low-level stress. By the time I reached the airlock, I could feel the vibration of the Meridian's approach through the hull itself, a low rumble that grew steadily stronger. Through a small viewport near the airlock door, I watched the massive shape of the human vessel maneuver into position, its docking clamps extending toward my ship with a precision that surprised me, given how rushed and reckless their approach had seemed only moments before. There was a loud clang as the clamps made contact, followed by a hiss of pressurized air as the docking seal engaged. My ship shuddered under the impact, and for a terrifying moment I thought the connection had failed, that the whole plan had gone wrong exactly as I feared it might. But then the warning lights on the airlock control panel shifted from red to a steady green, indicating a successful, secure connection. The airlock door began to open, and I found myself holding my breath, uncertain of what I would see on the other side. The first thing that struck me was the light. The Meridian's interior was brighter than I expected, warmer somehow, filled with a kind of golden illumination that felt different from the cold, efficient white lighting of Kelvari vessels. The second thing that struck me was the people. 3 humans stood just inside the airlock, and I remember studying their faces carefully, trying to read whatever I could from their expressions. A tall woman with dark hair pulled back tightly stepped forward first, her eyes scanning me with obvious concern rather than curiosity or calculation. Behind her stood a man with a shorter build, holding some kind of medical scanner, already pointing it in my direction. A third figure, taller still, stood slightly back, watching the doorway behind me as if still worried about further danger from my failing ship. The woman spoke first, and I recognized her voice as the one who had identified herself earlier. "I am Laura. This is Nathan, our medic, and that is Ryan, our captain. You are safe now. We need to get you to the medical bay and check your vitals, and then we need to see what we can do about your ship." I remember feeling a strange kind of disorientation in that moment, listening to her words. Safe now. It was such a simple phrase, and yet it struck me with unexpected force, after 8 days of believing that safety was something I might never experience again. Nathan stepped closer, running his scanner gently along my side, murmuring readings to himself that I did not fully understand. His expression remained focused but not unkind, and when he finally looked up at me, there was something almost gentle in the way he spoke. "You held up well, considering everything you have been through. Let's get you somewhere more comfortable." I found myself unable to respond immediately, still processing the strangeness of the situation. Everything about this rescue defied what I had been taught to expect. There was no cold calculation here, no careful weighing of risk against reward that I could detect. There was only urgency, and something else beneath it that I did not yet have a word for. Ryan Coleman remained near the airlock entrance, his attention shifting between me and the readouts on a small device in his hand, likely monitoring the condition of my failing ship even as his crew tended to me. When he finally spoke directly to me, his voice carried a weight of seriousness that matched the moment. "Your reactor is not going to hold much longer. We need to pull anything valuable off your ship quickly, and then we need to disengage before the instability spreads to affect the docking connection. Is there anything specific you need from the Solace before we go?" I thought of the data pad, where I had recorded my thoughts over the past several days, the small collection of words meant to be a record of who I was, in case no one ever found me. I asked if it would be possible to retrieve it, expecting perhaps a moment of hesitation given the danger of returning to the unstable ship, even briefly. Ryan did not hesitate at all. He simply nodded and moved past me toward the interior of my ship, calling back over his shoulder that he would find it. I stood there, stunned, as this human captain walked directly into a vessel with a failing reactor to retrieve a small personal item that held no practical value to anyone but me. I watched him disappear through the corridor, and for the first time since the crisis began, I felt something shift inside me. Not simply relief at being rescued, but a growing, confused sense that everything I had been taught about this species might be far less accurate than I had believed. Ryan returned a few minutes later, the datapad in his hand, along with a small case I recognized as containing personal effects I had stored near my bunk. He handed both to me without comment, as if retrieving a stranger's belongings from a dying ship was simply an ordinary part of his day. Moments later, the docking clamps released with a heavy mechanical sound, and the Meridian pulled away from the Solace, putting distance between the two vessels just as my old ship's reactor gave one final, violent shudder visible through the viewport. I watched through a small window as the Solace, my home for so many years, finally succumbed to the damage it had sustained. There was no explosion, only a slow collapse of its structure as the containment field failed completely and the reactor released its remaining energy in a controlled but final burst. It was a strange thing, watching a piece of my life end so quietly after everything that had happened. Nathan guided me toward the medical bay, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder, in a gesture I did not fully understand, but somehow found comforting. The medical bay itself was small but well organized, filled with equipment that looked worn from use but carefully maintained. He had me lie down on an examination table and began a more thorough scan, checking my vital signs, my hydration levels, the effects of 8 days of rationed food and stress on my body. "You are dehydrated and your energy reserves are low," he said, studying the readouts carefully. Nothing that a few days of proper rest and food will not fix. You are lucky. Another day or two out there, and this could have been a very different conversation. I studied his face as he spoke, trying to detect any trace of the coldness or calculation I had expected from a species my people described with such caution. Instead, I found only quiet professionalism, mixed with something that looked almost like relief on my behalf. "Why did you come?" I asked him, the question emerging before I had fully decided to voice it. "Your ship risked considerable damage docking directly with mine. You could have used a shuttle, taken a safer approach. Why take that risk for someone you had never met?" Nathan paused in his work, looking at me with an expression I found difficult to read at first, though I would later come to recognize it as simple confusion at the question itself, as if the answer should have been obvious. "Because you were still alive," he said simply. "That is really all there is to it." The simplicity of his answer struck me harder than any lengthy explanation could have. In my culture, decisions about resource allocation, about risk versus reward, about whether a rescue attempt was worth the potential cost, were made through careful calculation, weighing the value of a life against the value of the ship and crew that might be lost attempting to save it. Nathan's answer suggested no such calculation had taken place at all. The fact that I was alive had simply been enough. Over the following hours, as I regained my strength, I found myself observing the crew of the Meridian with growing fascination. Laura Bennett, the engineer who had first identified my failing reactor readings, spent considerable time in the ship's small common area, and I found myself drawn there as well, curious about this species that continued to defy my expectations at every turn. She was working on repairing a piece of equipment when I approached, her hands moving with practiced efficiency even as she carried on a conversation with another crew member about something that seemed to have little to do with the task at hand. I noticed she hummed quietly to herself as she worked, an unconscious habit that seemed to bring her some measure of comfort or focus. "May I ask you something?" I said, settling carefully into a seat nearby. "Of course," she replied without looking up from her work. "Your captain risked this ship to save me. He went back into a failing vessel for a personal item that held no value beyond sentiment. None of this makes sense according to what I understand about resource management and risk assessment. Is this normal behavior for your species, or is your captain unusual even among humans?" Laura laughed at this, though not unkindly, and finally looked up at me with an expression of genuine amusement mixed with something more thoughtful. "Ryan is a good captain, but he is not unusual. Not really. Most of us would have done the same thing. We do not really think about it as some kind of calculation. Someone needed help, we were close enough to help, so we did. That is pretty much the whole thought process." "But the cost," I pressed. "The risk to your own ship, your own lives. Surely that must factor into the decision somehow." "It does," she admitted, setting down her tools for a moment. "We are not reckless, whatever you might have heard about us. We do think about risk, but there is a difference between calculated risk and just leaving someone to die, because helping them might be inconvenient or costly. We would rather deal with some damage to our ship than live with the knowledge that we could have helped someone and chose not to." I sat with this answer for a long moment, turning it over in my mind. It was such a simple philosophy, and yet it stood in stark contrast to everything I had been taught. My people valued caution, valued the careful preservation of resources, valued rational decision-making above all else. And yet here was a species willing to risk everything, not because the numbers made sense, but because the alternative felt wrong to them on some fundamental level. As the days passed aboard the Meridian, I continued to witness small moments that reinforced this growing realization. When one of the ship's cargo containers shifted during a minor course correction, threatening to crush a piece of equipment that Laura had been working to repair for weeks, 2 crew members rushed to secure it without hesitation, risking minor injury to protect something that held no critical value to the mission itself, only sentimental value to their engineer. When the ship passed near a debris field that contained the wreckage of an old vessel, long since abandoned and stripped of anything valuable, Ryan ordered a brief detour to scan the wreckage for any sign of survivors or remains. despite there being no distress signal and no indication that anyone was still aboard. When Nathan asked why they bothered, given the clear age of the wreckage and the unlikelihood of finding anything, Ryan's answer was simple: just in case. I began to understand, slowly, that this was not simply the behavior of one unusual crew, but something deeper, woven into how humans approach the void itself. Where my people saw the vast emptiness of space as something to be navigated carefully and cautiously, always mindful of the cost of every decision, humans seemed to view it as something to be pushed back against, a darkness that needed to be met with stubborn persistence rather than careful calculation. One evening, if such a term even applied aboard a ship traveling through endless dark, I found myself sitting with Ryan in the small common area, sharing what passed for a meal among the human crew. He had been quiet for most of the meal, focused on some data readout in front of him, but eventually he set it aside and looked at me directly. "You have been asking a lot of questions," he said, not unkindly, "about us, about why we do what we do." "I have," I admitted. "Everything I was taught about your species suggested something very different from what I have witnessed here. I am trying to understand the difference." Ryan considered this for a moment before responding. "What were you taught, exactly?" I hesitated, unsure how honest to be, but decided the truth was owed to someone who had risked so much on my behalf. "I was taught that your species is reckless, driven by impulse rather than reason. That you take unnecessary risks without proper calculation. Some among my people respect this quality. Others see it as a dangerous flaw, one that will eventually lead to your downfall." Ryan nodded slowly, as if this was not the first time he had heard something similar. "It is not entirely wrong," he said. "We do take risks that probably do not make perfect sense on paper. We do act on instinct sometimes, more than pure logic. But I do not think that makes us reckless, not in the way you mean. It just means we value something different than pure calculation." "What do you value?" I asked. He thought about this for a long moment before answering. "Each other, mostly. And the idea that no one should be left behind if there is any way at all to help them. Maybe that seems inefficient from the outside. Maybe it costs us more than it should, sometimes. But I would rather live in a universe where someone comes for you when things go wrong than one where everyone just calculates the odds and moves on." I found myself thinking about my own culture's philosophy in a new light after that conversation. We prided ourselves on discipline, on careful judgment, on never wasting resources on causes that did not offer a reasonable return. And yet, sitting there on a human ship that had risked considerable damage to save a stranger from another species entirely, I began to wonder if something important had been lost in all that careful calculation. Over the following days, as the Meridian continued its journey toward the nearest point where I could be transferred back to Kelvari territory, I spent much of my time simply observing this crew, trying to understand them more deeply. I watched them argue playfully over small things, support each other through moments of frustration, and work together with a kind of easy trust that seemed to require no calculation at all, only shared experience and mutual reliance. I also watched them grieve, briefly, when Laura mentioned in passing that they had lost a crew member on a previous mission, someone who had died trying to help a stranded vessel much like mine, in circumstances that had not ended as fortunately. I expected this story to serve as evidence against the philosophy Ryan had described to me, proof that such reckless generosity carried real and sometimes fatal costs. Instead, when I asked Laura if this loss had changed how the crew approached rescue missions, her answer surprised me. "It made us more careful," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "But it did not make us stop trying. If anything, it reminded us why we do this in the first place. Because someone out there might need us, and if we do not go, who will?" I did not have an answer for her. In my own culture's philosophy, the answer to that question was simple and unemotional. If the risk was too great, no one would go, and the loss would be recorded, mourned quietly, and accepted as the cost of living in a dangerous universe. But here, aboard this ship, that answer felt hollow in a way I had never noticed before. By the time the Meridian approached the border of Kelvari territory, where I would be transferred to a proper medical facility and eventually make my way home, I had changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. The crew who had rescued me had shown me a version of courage and commitment that did not fit neatly into any framework my culture had given me. I did not yet know how to explain this to my own people, or whether they would even want to hear it, but I knew, with growing certainty, that I could never again think of humans the way I once had. The transfer point where the Meridian finally handed me over to a Kelvari medical vessel was a quiet outpost station at the edge of our territory, little more than a refueling point and a small hospital built to serve ships passing through this remote region. I remember standing at the airlock, saying goodbye to the crew who had saved my life, feeling a strange reluctance to leave, despite having spent so many days aboard their ship as an outsider rather than a true member of their crew. Laura hugged me before I left, a human gesture I had grown accustomed to over the past several days, though it still felt unfamiliar in a physical sense, given the differences in our anatomy. Nathan gave me a final checkup, declaring me fit enough to travel the rest of the way home under standard medical supervision. Ryan simply shook my hand, a gesture I had learned meant something significant among his people, and told me to take care of myself. I did not expect to feel as much sadness as I did watching the Meridian depart, its hull disappearing back into the dark of the void it had emerged from only days earlier. Something had shifted in me during my time aboard that ship, something I was not yet sure how to name or explain, even to myself. The Kelvari medical staff at the outpost treated me with the careful, efficient professionalism I had always known from my own people. They checked my vitals, reviewed my medical history, and asked detailed questions about the failure of the Solus and the circumstances of my rescue. When I mentioned that a human vessel had responded to my distress signal, I noticed a subtle shift in the attending physician's expression, a flicker of surprise quickly hidden behind professional composure. "You were rescued by humans," she said, her tone carefully neutral, though I could sense the question beneath the statement. "That is unusual. Most vessels in that region avoid direct contact with unclaimed distress signals, given the risk involved." I explained, as briefly as I could manage given my exhaustion, what had happened. The physician listened carefully, taking notes, but said little beyond what was necessary for my medical file. It was only later, during my formal debrief with a representative from the Kelvari Fleet Command, that I began to understand how significant my story would become. The debrief took place several days after my arrival at the outpost, once I had recovered enough strength to travel and speak clearly about the events that had led to my rescue. I was brought before a small panel of officers, 3 Kelvari elders whose expressions remained carefully composed throughout my account, though I could sense their growing interest as I described the details of the human crew's actions. "You are saying the human captain risked direct docking with an unstable vessel," one of the officers said, her tone carrying a note of disbelief rather than accusation. "This seems like an extraordinary risk to take for a survey pilot from another species, one with no formal alliance or treaty obligation to your people." I confirmed this was exactly what had happened, describing the speed of their approach, the urgency in their communications, and Ryan's decision to personally retrieve my datapad from the failing ship, despite the danger involved. The officers exchanged glances, and I could see skepticism in their expressions, though none of them directly challenged my account. "Did they request anything in return for this assistance?" Another officer asked. "Payment, resources, information about Kelvari territory or technology?" "Nothing," I answered honestly. "They asked for nothing beyond my well-being. When I offered to compensate them for the resources used during my rescue, Captain Coleman declined, stating that helping someone in need was not something that required payment." This answer seemed to trouble the officers more than reassure them. I understood why. In our culture, an act of significant risk without expectation of return was almost incomprehensible, the kind of behavior that suggested either deception or a fundamental misunderstanding of how resources should be managed. The idea that a crew would simply choose to help without calculation of benefit challenged assumptions that had shaped Kelvari philosophy for generations. The debrief continued for several hours, the officers asking increasingly detailed questions about human behavior, technology, and decision-making processes that I had witnessed during my time aboard the Meridian. I answered as honestly as I could, though I found myself growing frustrated with the underlying assumption in many of their questions, the persistent suggestion that there must be some hidden logic or ulterior motive behind what I had experienced as simple, direct kindness. Finally, one of the younger officers, who had remained mostly silent throughout the proceedings, asked a question that cut through the careful, clinical tone of the debrief. "What do you believe now about humans, having experienced this firsthand?" I considered the question carefully before answering, aware that my response would likely be recorded and analyzed alongside everything else I had shared that day. "I believe," I said slowly, "that we have misunderstood something important about this species. We have focused so much on the risks they take, the resources they seem willing to spend without calculation, that we have failed to understand why they take those risks in the first place. It is not recklessness. It is a different set of values entirely, one that places the life of an individual above the careful preservation of resources or the avoidance of risk. I do not know if this makes them stronger or weaker than us in the long run, but I know that without them, I would not be sitting here today." The room remained quiet for a long moment after I finished speaking. The senior officer, an elder whose composure had remained unbroken throughout the entire proceeding, finally spoke, her voice carrying a weight of consideration rather than dismissal. "Your account will be added to our growing record of human interactions," she said. "This is not the first report we have received describing similar behavior, though it is among the most detailed. We are beginning to understand that our previous assumptions about this species may require significant revision." I left that debrief with a strange mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that my account had been taken seriously, that the officers had not simply dismissed my experience as an anomaly or a misunderstanding. Frustration that even now, after everything I had witnessed, my own people continued to approach the subject of humans through the same careful, clinical framework that had shaped our understanding of the universe for so long. In the weeks that followed, as I returned to my home world and began the slow process of reintegrating into my normal life, I found myself unable to fully return to the person I had been before the solace was destroyed. I noticed things about my own culture that I had never questioned before, small moments of careful calculation that once seemed like wisdom but now felt, at times, like coldness. I remember visiting my family shortly after my return, sitting with my mother in the same quiet garden where she had called me in for meals when I was young. She listened to my account of the rescue with careful attention, her expression shifting through concern, relief, and finally something like quiet contemplation. "You sound different," she said, when I had finished telling her everything. "Not just tired from your ordeal, different in how you speak about things." I told her about the philosophy Ryan had shared with me, about valuing each other over calculated risk, about the idea that no one should be left behind if there was any way at all to help them. I told her about Laura's answer when I asked about the crew member they had lost, about how the loss had made them more careful, but had never made them stop trying to help others in need. My mother was quiet for a long time after I finished speaking, her gaze fixed on some point in the distance beyond the garden walls. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a thoughtfulness I had not expected. "We have always told ourselves that our way is the wise way," she said. "That careful calculation protects more lives in the long run than reckless risk-taking ever could. Perhaps that is true, in some ways. But I wonder now if we have convinced ourselves of something that is not entirely honest. I wonder if some part of our caution has become an excuse to avoid the harder, more costly choice of truly caring for one another, even at great cost to ourselves." I did not have a complete answer for her, and I am not certain I have one even now, long after these events took place. What I do know is that something fundamental shifted in my understanding of the universe during those days aboard the Meridian, watching a crew of humans risk everything for a stranger who owed them nothing and could offer them nothing in return. I have thought often, in the time since my rescue, about what truly defines a species, what truly matters when measuring the worth of a civilization against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the void. My people have built great things through careful calculation and disciplined resource management. We have survived and thrived for centuries through caution and wisdom that has protected countless lives from unnecessary risk. But I have come to believe that there is something equally important, something that cannot be measured through careful calculation alone. The willingness to reach out into danger for someone you have never met, simply because they are alive and in need, is not a flaw in judgment or a failure of discipline. It is, perhaps, one of the most important qualities a species can possess. I think often of Ryan's simple answer when I ask him why they had come for me, why they had risked their ship and their lives for a stranger from another world entirely. Because you were still alive. That is really all there is to it. There is a kind of wisdom in that simplicity that I did not understand before my time in the long quiet, before the solace failed and left me drifting alone in the vast dark, waiting for a rescue I did not believe would come. I have since learned that humans do not always calculate the odds before deciding to help someone. They do not always weigh the cost against the potential benefit with the careful precision that my own culture has valued for generations. Sometimes they simply act, driven by something that exists beyond calculation entirely, something that values the life of a stranger as much as the lives of their own crew. I do not know if this makes humans a stronger species than my own, in the ways that matter for long-term survival across the vast reaches of space. Perhaps our caution will prove wiser in the end. Perhaps their willingness to take risks for others will eventually cost them more than they can afford. I cannot say with certainty how these different philosophies will shape the future of either of our peoples. What I can say, with complete certainty, is that I am alive today because a crew of humans chose to answer a distress signal that most other species would have calculated as too risky to pursue. I am alive because a captain named Ryan Coleman decided that the value of a single life outweighed the danger to his own ship. I am alive because an engineer named Laura Bennett and a medic named Nathan treated a stranger from another world with the same care and concern they would have shown one of their own crew members. The void is vast, and it is indifferent to the small struggles of any single life caught within it. I learned this lesson intimately during those long days drifting in the long quiet, watching the stars burn steadily onward, unconcerned with my fate. But I also learned that within that vast indifference there are still those who choose to care, who choose to reach out into the darkness for someone they have never met, simply because doing so is the right thing, regardless of the cost or the calculation. I carry that lesson with me now, in everything I do. When my own people ask me about humans, about the strange and seemingly reckless behavior that so many still view with suspicion, I tell them the truth as plainly as I can. They are not reckless. They are not driven purely by impulse without thought for consequence. They have simply decided, as a species, that the life of another matters more than careful calculation, more than the safe preservation of resources, more than any cold assessment of risk versus reward. I do not know what the future holds for the relationship between my people and humanity. I do not know if the growing awareness of encounters like mine will lead to greater understanding, or if old suspicions will continue to color how we view this remarkable species. But I know what I witnessed, drifting alone in the dark with nothing but a failing reactor and a fading hope, and I know what arrived just in time to change everything. I was stranded deep in the void, certain that my story would end quietly, unremarkably, another small loss recorded and forgotten within the vast indifference of space. Instead, humanity arrived, not because careful calculation demanded it, but because somewhere among the stars, someone heard a stranger's call for help and simply could not turn away. That is the lesson I carry with me now, and it is one I hope, in time, my own people will come to understand as deeply as I have.